quick reminder, each episode could contain some game spoilers, so please listen or watch with discretion. And now, your hosts for The Gamer's Advocate, AMKomnenos, Banana, and Legion. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of The Gamer's Advocate, where you get 1,000 gamers in a room, you'll probably get 1,000 different opinions, and we discuss games that we love to hate and hate to love. Today's topic is going to be about cinematics in video games, or really how games are presented in scenes. So we'll go into a little bit more detail about that as we go. But before we do that, often we have antagonists in games, and is there a particular antagonist that, although we don't get the opportunity to do so, that you would like to maybe have played out or seen a scene, not only just a cinematic, but even just maybe even play a portion of their story, or maybe even an entire game?
Yeah. Now, this isn't an individual protagonist per se, but it's more a game that I want and that I feel like I might need. So I've mentioned briefly in the past my love and adoration for Helldivers. I want the inverse of Helldivers. I want a grand strategy game where I am controlling this bug horde, and we're going to go take over the world against this fascistic human empire. I want to play that. And at the same time, I want to control all the robots as well, so we're fighting on the two fronts. I've got my one bug horde full of just pointless cannon fodder that we just throw at our enemies. And then I want to control those slightly more elite bots, strategically where to use them, using the tanks, using the walkers, etc. So I want that weird power fantasy of playing as the baddies and taking, are there baddies in that universe? Of playing as the traditional baddies and taking over the world, not fighting to defend humanity's outposts, but just trying our best to rip and grind our way through them. And if you're thinking Stellaris already exists, you can have this. No. Because I want that battlefield mode as well. I want that.
I was going to say, you just described StarCraft.
No, I want to play as the Bile Titan. I want to be stepping on things. I want to be spewing everywhere. In fact, I think I just want this in Helldivers. I want to be able to play as the aliens in Helldivers, essentially playing as a sort of DM type figure, where I get to decide where they go, and if I wish, I can assume control and take over the body of one of them, if needed. That's what I want.
I think you just described the game mode in Left 4 Dead 2 and Back 4 Blood.
No, I didn't.
Play as the infant.
No, I didn't. Move on. What are you talking about?
I mean, clearly it's a very different environment, but I believe that's the concept.
No, I think you're right, actually. Yeah, but that idea of being sort of the DM playing against the human crowd, I think that sounds fantastic.
Well, I was off the top of my head, I mean, I could think of several enemies, but thinking about like playable, I mean, there's been a lot of games where like I thought, I like to play as maybe the alien in Aliens, but that's been done. I was like, I could do that actually. So I had to think about a game that I would like to do that hasn't already been done. I think maybe one of them would be maybe something like Diablo in Diablo, where you are actually going against the angels, because there is that faction. You see like the end result, like especially in Diablo 3, where you're in heaven and you have all these bodies of angels everywhere because of Diablo's gone through the gates of heaven and has, ransacked the place and just been killing the angels left and right. It'd be kind of neat to play as Diablo for a little bit, just so that you can kind of mess up heaven for a little bit. Thought that might be neat.
Why am I not surprised that your fantasy was to literally wage war on heaven?
As the devil, yeah.
Yes. Pick the single most evil character you can think of, and you're like, yeah, that's me. That's who I want to be.
I want that guy.
For me, I think it would be Patches in Dark Souls and Elden Ring. I think Patches is just such a fascinating character, branching across all of those games that aren't necessarily connected. He just seems to appear everywhere, and he's always a bit of a dick, but also weirdly helpful at times. I think he's just so interesting, and there are so many different moments in those games where Patches appears and you're just kind of wondering, like, how did you get here? I just feel like if they were to give him almost his own game, or minor sequences in each of the games where you meet him, where you get to kind of see his point of view. It would be very interesting.
I'm imagining a series of short games, sort of 2 or 3 hours long, and they're almost going to be titled like Friends episodes. You know, the one where Patches ended up in Dark Souls, and just whatever the hell happened that brought him there. I'd love that. I'm 100% on board. I want that game, or those games. Speaking of Soulsborne, I think this is fundamentally flawed, but I like the idea. I want to be able to play a boss run of Dark Souls, just all the way through, just all the bosses one after the other, just an arena mode almost. But I want my friends to be able to play as the bosses. I have no doubt it would be a clumsy piece of crap because they all control so awkwardly and so differently and so weirdly. But the idea that if you play someone who's actually good at that, and now they play a little differently to how the enemy really does when you're playing them, when there's that automation, so you can kind of figure out what's going on, I think that'd be amazing. If you were lucky enough to have someone who could play well as those bosses.
I think the major issue with that is the your friends part, because the people you would play that with are going to ruin it for you. I just imagine
because you don't have any.
I just imagine everybody refusing to give you that brief window where you get to attack or counterattack. They're waiting for you to initiate and you're waiting for them. And so you just have this never ending standoff where you're circling around the arena staring at each other.
It sounds brilliant and awful. How different that is. Yes.
So if we look at the role in, when we talk about cinematics in games, we've talked before about how Resident Evil has the fixed camera versus maybe a first person point of view or an over the shoulder point of view. So it's not just cinematics, but it's really more or less how the gameplay presents the scenes. Any examples that you have, Banana?
I think probably the most obvious example to me is the isometric RPG, things like Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. That presentation of information, that kind of strategic view, really suits those games to give you kind of this overhead view of what is going on with the action, help you to strategize a little bit more, help you to see enemies that people in a first-person view would not be able to see. And I think it kind of probably pulls that from, RTS games, things like that, where the strategy is the focus, and so they give you this overhead view because it provides the most strategic advantage. And I think that is kind of pulled into Dragon Age Inquisition, if I remember. Yeah. There is a way to enter strategic view where you look at top down. I never used it, but it's in there.
Big disappointment. They talked about it quite a lot in the pre-release period of Dragon Age Inquisition, because a lot of people, particularly fans of the classic RPGs, were maybe disappointed with Dragon Age 2 is the wrong way to put it, but they did really want to have this pullback to the initial Dragon Age, to Baldur's Gate, etc. So I remember in a reveal trailer, they specifically talked for a good few minutes about the ability to roll that camera back and have that top-down strategic view. Honestly, I used it a few times. It felt awkward as hell, clumsy, pretty tacked on. And I think if the game isn't made specifically and initially with that in mind, we had an example there of how awkward that can be to suddenly fix on top of the game you already have.
Right. Because it's actually pretty versatile. You can actually tell your player to go from point A to point B, and then when you're at point B, cast this spell or something. So it actually has some versatility to it, but by the time you get to point B, your situation could change. Like that enemy could be already dead, and now you need to go focus on a different one. So it really didn't provide the features that I think that they were trying to implement.
I think it's a tremendous example, though, especially leading on from where Banana did, sorry to interrupt you, from Baldur's Gate, because it was one of those modern attempts to bring back this camera that we really weren't using that much until quite recently, when we saw the resurgence of games with that classic computer RPG style. So nowadays you have lots of games like Wasteland we talked about, like Rogue Trader, like, well, Baldur's Gate,
Pathfinder too. Yeah.
Pathfinder, exactly.
And I was gonna say, I feel like that's Dragon Age Inquisition is the example where they refuse to heed our very incredible advice of, if you're gonna do something, do it well, because that was not done well. And I used it in the tutorial where it forces you to switch into that mode and then never again.
I think that is, oddly enough, and this is a very strange idea, but that's a video game genre almost defined by a camera. Because when you think about the variety that you can have in these games, you can have games in sci-fi settings, you can have games in fantasy settings, you can have modern games, you could have games that are based on close combat rather than range combat. You can have games with magic and no magic, but they all take on this very similar fundamental feeling simply because we put the camera up there and you're looking down from that angle. And I love the idea of a game genre being almost defined by that one angle. And another one that came into my mind while we were talking about that, and it's a very different kind of game, is Crash Bandicoot. And that is a game where they use the camera really, really well. You've got really 3 different kinds of platforming missions in Crash Bandicoot. You've got the camera behind you, up slightly above your shoulder, looking down. You see the entire course ahead of you, and you're going to go ahead, platform past these objects, etc., etc., etc. Then you've got the classic platformer, which would look a bit more like a Rayman. And this is in Crash Bandicoot. Looks more like Rayman, looks more like Mario from the side. And you can see as you walk along the top of all these platforms how you have to judge these obstacles. And then they have a third one where that camera is up in the sky, but you're now running towards the camera. Normally, if you're being chased by a boulder, a bit like an Indiana Jones, something like that. And they managed to use their camera style to affect an entirely different feeling across these levels. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful use of a very simple tool to make your game feel so incredibly different. Something that could have felt very repetitive. Crash Bandicoot, it's a platformer, but they did incredible work with that camera.
I think you bringing up Crash Bandicoot and then mentioning Mario triggered a little memory of Mario 64 and the greatest villain of that game being the camera. Because, and I will say, I still very much enjoy Mario 64, and this element of the camera being frustrating and difficult to use is very much a result of Mario 64 being the first Mario game in 3D. It's not so much it's so obvious they should have done it this way as much as it is they were in uncharted territory and they did their best, and it's clunky. It works. I've gone back to play that game. I've played the entirety of that game, 120 stars in one sitting before, because I enjoy that game, but I hate that camera.
Well, it's like you said, when you have a trendsetter, it suffers naturally in hindsight because it's that first real attempt at doing something. And I think it existed in something that we've mentioned before in this podcast about multiple subjects. And it's that sense of evolution in video gaming. The quantum leaps, if you will, between styles that we used to have. They don't really have anymore purely because of where we are technologically in gaming and how far we have advanced. Maybe there are still these leaps to come. I don't know. But if you think of how for many, many years, until really, in my mind, it's Halo, but I could be wrong. Until Halo, games didn't really tend to agree on what button on the controller fired the gun. They didn't tend to agree that the right stick altered the height and angle at which you were aiming your weapon. We didn't tend to agree that we're going to have this universal grenade button, which I think was the left bumper on the Xbox. But this idea of that standardized language of games over time only comes when a new trendsetter comes along. And then that second generation just after that trendsetter have had the chance to really refine the thing that trendsetter tried to do. So in this case, you have Mario 64 tries to give you this full, because it's fully rotatable, that camera, right? You essentially control it.
Mhm.
Prior to that,
I don't
mean,
think
if we
you
think,
could control vertical axis
okay,
particularly well, but I think it was discrete in the sense that, like, if you tried to move the camera to the right, it would jump 30 degrees to the right.
Mm.
And then another movement would jump another 30 degrees. So everything felt kind of rigid and there wasn't a fine tuning within that angle. But it
I
would give
see.
you a slightly better view or
That makes
much
sense.
worse.
Yeah, but like I said, the first attempt at doing this, because
Mhm.
if you think prior to that, and games like Resident Evil, fixed camera, Metal Gear Solid, roughly fixed camera, Final Fantasy games, fixed camera with the painted backdrops. This is a brave step into uncharted territory, which today we take entirely for granted.
Mhm.
I know when I pick up a game that's third person, if I use the left stick, I'm going to move. And if I use the right stick, I'm going to orbit that camera around me and get all those different views that I want. But we didn't standardize that language until a lot later.
Metroid had its best games as the platform style. And it's kind of hard to comment that those were the best games because of it, though. I think they kind of really fell into the spirit of the game. The original Super Metroid, the Return of Samus, and then Dread recently. They're all in that platform style, and they all work exceptionally. I mean, they're definitely probably the best games of the series. Metroid Prime, very good game, but it's in that 3D first person at times perspective. So that way you have to aim at things. You have to. So it's a very different type of game. Some people definitely love Prime. For a lot of people that was like their entry into Metroid. So there's some maybe nostalgia there, but the best performing games were easily the platform ones. And so I couldn't say it was necessarily due to the style of that, but I think it had a lot to do with it because it just really played the way it was kind of intended. How you integrated yourself into the environment. Because when they talk about Metroidvania, with the whole Castlevania Metroid style, I mean, there's a reason why it's called that because it invented the style. It did what it's good at. But there's certain games that I think could probably lend itself to more camera control, and I think some of the Dark Souls games, like even Elden Ring, I think the boss battles, they're at the camera. They design those so that because they know the camera's at a certain fixed position, but when you're talking about like zooming in, zooming out, I mean that's just not an option because things don't clip into like the world, right? If you're against a mountain or something, when you turn around, you're going to be like really close to your character or really far, the default view. Really think that it could probably, in the world, in the open world at least, should give you like some camera control because it's I think some people have even said the biggest enemy in that game is, or those games, is the camera. It just fights you.
Camera, gravity.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's one of those two.
That's been a fairly common criticism. Yeah, there's even something, even though I haven't finished it yet, in the DLC, there is a boss where I feel the way that they've designed the arena doesn't concur with the way that the camera is controlled in the game. And it's very, very awkward. And if you end up fighting the boss up near the arena walls, you're going to have a terrible time. You almost have to design the game around how the camera is operating. And in that case, very specifically, they chose not to or didn't notice. I don't like to use didn't notice with games because of how much effort even the simplest thing in a video game actually takes. But something that was eventually overlooked, and it's very, very awkward and clumsy.
The other side of the coin is, games like Oblivion, Skyrim, where you have full control of first person versus, moving back quite a ways. But then again, the combat in those games is not not its main feature. I think you have to go to first person if you're going to do something like archery or something, right? So you have the crosshairs and things, but it's really hard to do that when you're looking directly overhead or maybe even over the shoulder or something. But you kind of have to go into the first person just to kind of make the combat even playable.
I feel like the specific mechanic you mentioned there, archery, the ranged combat, I think that is where this topic plays its biggest role. And you'll see it in a lot of, there's, two major categories: first-person and third-person shooters. And first-person shooters sacrifice that spatial awareness of the area around you, in that you cannot see when you're backing into an obstacle. And third-person shooters sacrifice that direct line of sight to know when you are completely behind cover or when an obstacle is in your way to try and fire on your target. And I don't have an answer as to which one works better, because I know in first-person shooters I have lost my mind over the fact that I cannot navigate the arena by feel, which is, I mean, there's nothing developers can do about that. I either need to memorize the area around me or switch to a third-person view. And in third-person view, I sacrifice accuracy, which I also don't want to do. There's really just no pleasing me.
Well, I was just thinking of a game that just came to my mind that I think does a good job with the choice between first-person and third-person cameras, and pardon me, is the modern editions of Deus Ex, where the game takes place almost entirely in a first-person camera when you're walking around, when you're interacting with the world. But whenever you go into cover, it switches to a third-person camera. And I liked that, just for that, because when I'm playing a role-playing game like this, I think first-person view it does more for me than a third-person view does. I find it much easier to put myself in the shoes of the character, because quite literally, I'm in that character's shoes. However, in combat sometimes I do like that extra idea of having that awareness that you would have in real life. Sure, in real life you don't have a third-person camera, but you've got your sense of hearing, you feel the vibrations in the floor if someone runs around next to you. So the third-person camera gives you a way to compensate for that lack of sense you don't actually perceive in a video game. So that lovely combination, I think, worked really, really well. The other thing briefly about Skyrim I was going to say that I just didn't like was, I thought the first-person view, this is almost the contrary, for Deus Ex. The first-person view really enhanced the combat. First-person for melee and first-person for bow and arrow, or archery. Because I just felt the combat is so light in Skyrim that when you're in third-person, it barely feels like you're in a fight. Everything is so floaty. The way that your character just kind of like floats when he runs across the ground, there's no adaptation of the gait according to what the terrain is like. It looks so odd. But when you're up close and you're that first-person camera, and there's that little extra effort of your character blocks a blow with a shield and the shield dents backwards, and you got that ka-dunk nice and close, felt it really added to the weight, and made the combat feel much more satisfying than the third-person camera ever could.
I feel like the third-person camera in Skyrim was something I almost never touched. It was almost exclusively to look at my equipment. Be like, oh, that's really cool looking. Let's never see it again.
Same, I think. Maybe once in a while. No, I know what I would always do, and it's that you zoom out behind the camera, you hold right click behind the character. Sorry, you hold right click, you run straight forward, and if you hold right click and you turn the camera around your character doesn't change perspective. They keep running in a straight line, so you can orbit your character with the camera. And have a cool.
I was going to say, or you could just let it go AFK, and the camera kind of does that for you.
Oh no, but you can do this while running.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Mass Effect probably for me did a really great job with the squad mechanics, because you're over the shoulder. And a lot of people, I've heard a ton of criticisms over it. I'm like, really think it works though. Squad mechanics aside, because if you're going to do something like a sniper, you can look through the scope.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an automatic rifle, even with a scope, it zooms in, but not all the way, because that's not its real intention, right? You're supposed to do a rapid fire here. So I think it really works in the scenario that you give it. And when you're used to using hotkeys like me, I mean, it's real easy to go first person, sniper, come back out, do my incinerate or whatever I'm going to do. Tell my squad mate to go over here, go over there. And I need all that to be over the shoulder so I can see what's going on. I need to see the battlefield in front of me and be able to take my sniper shot if I'm using a sniper rifle. Or take my scoped pistol, SMG, AR, whatever I'm doing. I need to be able to see that with full functionality. And I think for me, at least in that scenario with that type of game, that over the shoulder is just beautiful.
You'll hear no reproach from me about it. I think Mass Effect does its combat mechanics so incredibly well. They're very much of its time. It feels like a game that came out around 2013 or so. But that's not a criticism. That's just it being from when it's from. The actual execution, I think, was about as well as we could ever have expected. And it's one of the few games I've found where the ability to control your party from within the third person combat, it's one of the first games and only games I've played where that mechanic doesn't do my head in. I think it's done very, very well. And being able to actually control your characters, your party members, sorry, genuinely feels like a pleasure. You genuinely feel like a battlefield commander and not just someone micromanaging.
I agreed with you up until that last point.
I hate you.
I hate controlling squad movement in that game because they never stay where you send them. They always strafe into the line of fire, or they always take cover right next to you. And it's like, I told you to go to the other side of the planet so this wouldn't happen. But
Can I say skill issue?
overwhelmingly, I would say Mass Effect did it almost perfectly. I feel like, and that is probably a limitation of the technology in terms of writing AI for NPCs. Um, Knowing when they disengage from cover is probably not a very easy thing to figure out. But when it happened in game, it was very frustrating for me. But overwhelmingly, Mass Effect did an excellent job.
One thing Dragon Age did is that you could give a profile to your character. So if you wanted them to be defensive, um, defend mainly just you, or be more of a healer or something like that. I think Mass Effect probably could have benefited from some of that, because I think what's happening, this is just me, because at the time it's kind of hard to see what's going on, but I think they're given a certain AI. So for instance, like let's say you have Rex and you tell him to take cover behind that pillar or something. If he's being shot at, he may already have the AI telling him he needs to shoot back. that may be what's going on. So even though you've told him to go there, he may have been shot in the process of going there, and that disrupted the flow of what his instructions were from you. So I think that if they had incorporated your ability to say, listen to my directions first, or listen, be the aggressor, that might have limited some of the issues that were going on with the direction of your squad on the battlefield. So, but that's just me. So
Let's do an episode on party AI sometime, actually. I'd love it. I'd love to, especially being able to talk like Final Fantasy 12, Final Fantasy 13. I think that could be pretty interesting.
And honestly, I think the Baldur's Gate games with the enhanced
Yeah.
edition and the custom scripts, that was an excellent addition to add that advanced AI script that was like, these are the major points you're going to control. Because I thought the other scripts that were kind of by default included with the game were not ever what I wanted for specific roles.
yeah, because once you start learning like the Dragon Age Origin tactic portion of it, you start diving into it and realize, oh, this is actually really good. And once you start really diving into it, because you have like an if-then scenario. So you can have like on your fourth thing for them to do, but because those three other parameters haven't been met, the fourth thing could be like, if your health is below 25%, make sure you drink your health potion or something like that. Or if if they're like, say, a healer, for instance, you can say if a party member, or if you, the lead person, has a health below 50%, make sure you heal me. So no matter what they're doing, that hits that parameter, that's what they do. That's how Dragon Age Origin works. It's actually really complicated and highly versatile.
It took me a while to place while you were describing that, but I think that's exactly the way Final Fantasy XII's AI works, is you can set conditions and priorities. So a high priority task that requires a very specific condition probably won't come up as much, but when it does, you're telling this character, do this before anything else. So, if another character's health drops below 10%, heal them immediately, and then worry about any of the other conditions. And I think that, yeah, that's exactly what I was looking
This
for in
sounds like
terms of an
it's
AI.
yeah, it sounds like it's coming off topic with our cinematic discussion, but
Oh, no,
Because it
absolutely.
is. Yeah, because it's got nothing to do
but
with
it
it.
does come full circle because it actually affects how we play the game, which is what we will see. And so, like I said, when we talk about squad mechanics, and really Dragon Age Origins is essentially a squad mechanic game. I've talked about this before with the Nier Automata. It transitions quite a bit based on the actual scene, because you have moments where it's almost like a Galaga, where you're just fighting as a fighter plane, and then you're also, it'll drop down to a eye level, and then you are moving forward and you're going in and out of buildings, and then it'll change to your humanoid, and that person will go as a platformer, almost kind of like a Metroid style. And then you're in a boss battle where everything's much larger than you, so the camera pulls out even further so you can see what you're doing, and it does it just seamlessly. It's like, I've never complained about the camera in Nier Automata.
All happens within like the first 10 minutes of that game.
Yep.
It took me a bit to place what you were talking about, because I'm thinking of, the overwhelming majority of that game is the third person view for outside of vehicle combat. But in those moments where you are in that vehicle, they do such an excellent job of capturing very different camera angles and kind of showcasing when they are the appropriate camera angle. It was almost like an explanation of when to use these camera angles, and then they were like, "All right, now we're gonna go do our game."
Yeah, and then you're doing it, and what's really talking cinematics again. You're doing all this, you're moving in and out, you're doing the camera, you're actually trying to, your brain is trying to process everything that's going on. Plus, there's a story being told to you, and then boom, here comes a really cool cinematic. I'm like, oh,
But yeah, that definitely highlights the connection between your camera angle or your cinematic decision making on the view of the player and the mechanics that are available to you in that scene. So, I mean, we've briefly talked about Resident Evil. We've gone into this in other episodes, but Resident Evil gives you very fixed camera angles, and then the character's movement is based on that camera angle. Uh, or I'm sorry, the character's movement is tank controls in Resident Evil 1 and 2, I believe.
Yeah.
And the tank controls were necessary because the camera angle changes with every room transition. And sometimes you need to run through multiple rooms. You kind of just need to hold forward. But in other games, you'll notice that it creates an issue if you just hold in the direction you were running on one scene. You load into the next scene and you end up running back into the previous room because now the camera angle has changed. So the tank controls were kind of the way to navigate around that, so you didn't end up accidentally racing back into what you're trying to get away from.
right. Because if you're hitting W to move forward, and then the scene changes to where the door behind you is to your north, then you're hitting W to go north, and that's kind of what Banana's saying, is that it's different in those games.
It was clear.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I was just thinking, because
I'm just waiting for a comment to be, it was not clear.
It's me. I
It's
wrote
like,
that.
I'm glad Legion explained that, because I didn't understand what he was thinking.
Yeah.
From me.
Yeah. But further down, I really wish Com hadn't insisted on intervening. Signed, me. The game I had in mind, because it's a bad example of that, and they use a very similar camera setup, was Heavy Rain. So it's, as I believe most of us will have seen, you have a series of games, Indigo Prophecy, known as Fahrenheit in Europe, Heavy Rain, the other one, and then Detroit Become Human. I forgot what it's called. Detroit Become Human is the most recent of the series. It's very cinematic in the quite literal sense of how you play it. The game has fixed camera angles. It's set up as individual movie scenes. And in that game, Heavy Rain in particular, it seems as though they were in yet another transition period where they were still working out exactly how the controls should alter as you move from fixed camera angle to fixed camera angle. And I can remember playing it and finding moments where I just couldn't figure out what button press would move me in which direction. Just really not understanding which one would do it. And almost having to do the guesswork. So your camera appears on a new frame, you stop for a second, and then you tap up, and all of a sudden your character's going left. So then you push right to make them go back up, but actually they weren't going left, they were continuing a pivot to go down. And it was very, very awkward. So it was one of those odd camera setups, the fixed camera, which I think we're just going to really not see anymore. As much of a shame as it is, because when they're done well, like the Iron Resident Evil, they're such an amazing atmospheric tool, because we get to decide. As game developers, you're going to view this scene the way I want you to. We can play our inner Alfred Hitchcock. We can play and decide you will view this scene this way, which means now that mirror that I've put in that room, we can use that mirror. You can see the enemy in the mirror first if you're looking closely enough. But it just has that massive trade-off of the awkward way that it controls, because it feels so unintuitive. And especially in the modern day when we're used to having that control over the camera. That as sad as it may be, I do fear that those games are resigned to the past.
I was going to say, I feel like there are more examples of the failed camera in fixed camera games. I mean, even in moments of Final Fantasy VII, I feel like you're presented with confusing information from a fixed camera angle. There's moments where your frame of reference seems to be rotating. I think in some of the scenes where Cloud is kind of experiencing an existential crisis. Yeah. There's rotation in what is being presented to you, and it's not clear what direction you're moving ever. Even if you're trying to piece it together by changing the direction you're controlling, the character is always rotating, so it moved in a direction that didn't fit what happened 10 seconds ago, and now I have less data than I did 10 seconds ago. And I feel like that's... I mean, the example of Mario 64 would be kind of the failed version in a camera that you control, but again, that was the first in that genre, so it's almost forgiven that it's not quite as polished as it's going to be very soon.
I seem to remember even awkwardness in Final Fantasy VIII, which was a full year and a bit later, just where they had time. But I think the inherent awkwardness really of the fixed camera is what was causing them a problem. It wasn't a problematic development, it wasn't a lack of attention, it was just it in and of itself poses problems. Sorry, Legion, I cut you off.
You just triggered my memory of that escape from Galbadia prison.
That's where I just stopped playing it recently. Sidling across the pull-up.
First of all, I don't even know which side I was supposed to go to initially.
No, it doesn't tell you.
And then the controls not matching up to the camera angle didn't help either.
I hadn't saved.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm not going back.
Oh. No, yeah. That'll make me abandon that game forever.
Yeah. Sorry, Legion. We had memories.
No, you're good. There's a game, lesser known game. I'm pretty sure y'all don't know it, but it's called Broken Pieces. It's a relatively newer game, but it does give you the option.
So familiar.
Yeah, it's
a broken sword.
It's about a woman who has some insomnia, so there's some tropes there, right? But it's a very for some reason you're having to go out and fend for yourself, and so you have a gun and you have to do some target practice and this and that. So it has some Silent Hill meets Resident Evil type vibes without the actual horror. So it's really an interesting game. But the point here is,
honestly, when you said she has amnesia and a gun, I was immediately terrified. So.
Well, it gives you the option though to do, I think it calls it traditional camera, which is you're able to kind of like orbit, or fixed. So you can either,
which is weirdly not traditional.
right. And I'm trying to remember if that's what it called it or not, but it does give you the option if you want to play in that style or the other style. So it is an interesting, it lets you kind of like figure out maybe you may not like the way we wanted you to see the game. So it was kind of an interesting option. I think that's the most what I took out of that game, to be honest.
Sorry, that is a fantastic review.
Yeah.
To sum it up with, that's all I took from that game.
Yeah, like I said, it's one of those games that I really had high hopes for. I like the description and everything, but like I said, I play a lot of games, but I would have normally never brought it up if we not been talking about this whole camera thing.
Well, the brief digression or the brief side note really put me in another frame of mind as well. That I think Broken Sword, when it went from its fixed camera angle 2D planes into, I think it's with Broken Sword 3, the 3D world, it became so much clunkier, so much more awkward, and borderline unplayable at times. And it's one of those games where it really, in my mind, relies on that old style of fixed camera. And without that, it doesn't really work.
I think that transition from 2D to 3D is difficult to navigate for a lot of games. I've already said my piece about how Zelda navigated that, but I think there are plenty of other examples of mechanics that don't work when you try to bring them into 3D. And I think with those fixed camera angles, you also have this kind of unique opportunity for secrets that you don't have if a character can look around the entire room. So with the fixed camera angles in Resident Evil, you will see foreground objects that kind of block your view of what's going on in the background. And sometimes, less so in Resident Evil, but in other fixed camera games, there will be a secret that is behind those foreground objects. So an item that you could pick up that's not inherently visible. But if you were able to rotate the camera, that's not a secret anymore. It's painfully obvious. And you lose that when you expand the player's control of the camera.
It's a great example. And there are a few in Resident Evil 1, certainly in the remake, that I hadn't even thought of. But yeah, that ability to plant these little surprises for the player using the camera. It's just something unique to that style.
Yeah, the original Tomb Raider games did let you view things, but that's the thing, is that when you're actually moving, though, it's almost like you really wish that it didn't give you those options, because it's too easy to be looking this way, but Laura decides to jump cat-a-corner from that because that's how the camera was pointed. So it's almost like a curse to have the camera give you some options. But yeah,
if I remember correctly, when Tomb Raider 1 came out, the DualShock controller hadn't been invented, right? So you didn't really have the luxury of just doing your little camera adjustment, because you were still stuck on simply having the D-pad, so you needed another dedicated button to allow you to move the camera. So if you were slightly off, you couldn't just do a quick fix. You had to stop, change.
I did it on PC, so I couldn't really comment. So yeah.
You just clarified the Mario 64 issue for me. The reason the camera moved discreetly is because there was only one analog stick on the N64 controller.
Right in the middle, right?
Yes, and the camera controls were driven by the C-pad, which was 4 directional buttons. So you had to associate camera movement with a discrete button press.
I'd forgotten about that. Wow.
Ah, man, that controller was a nightmare.
Yeah, what a piece of shit that was. For everything good you can say about it, and Nintendo, they do attempt to innovate, and sometimes they hit it out of the park. Then there's the other times.
Yeah.
You guys don't even understand. Like with the NES, I was used to 2 buttons and the 4 directional button, the 1 directional button. And then when it went to the Super NES, I was like, there's 2 extra buttons here. It blew my mind.
Super Nintendo had shoulder buttons.
Yeah,
too,
that's what I'm saying. It's the shoulder buttons and the extra 2 there. Yeah. And I was like, don't know what to do with this.
Way more complicated.
Yeah, no, it blew my mind. It blew my little tiny mind. But
And then you get to the Xbox Elite controller, and there's paddles on the back, and I'm like, I have no idea what to do with this. I'm
For me-
clenching my hands, and suddenly the camera's gone.
I mean, there were three. They're like sort of quantum leaps. The first was I bought a Genesis or Mega Drive controller at one point that had a second row of buttons. So it normally had ABC. This had ABC, X, Y, Z.
Mhm.
That was bizarre. Second was when PlayStation introduced the analog sticks, which in the end turns out to be one of the biggest, massive improvements we've ever made with games controllers. But that moment of having those buttons, whoa. And then the
Yeah,
last one
I
was
was not on board in that moment.
no,
And
because
now, you know,
all it felt like it was
15 years later, I'm
for
like, this is the best idea ever.
yeah, but it felt like it was only for Ape Escape when it came out. Like no, it turns out there's so much more. And then the final thing was, and it's a shame that it didn't hang around. It didn't get everything right, but I think the Steam controller didn't get the due that it deserved. I think that was a really interesting controller,
Mhm.
but like the trackpad on there, paddles on the back, I felt like a dog flying a helicopter. Like I'm in no way prepared for this, but I'm on. I'm in. But yeah, no, those were big moments for me in controller advancement.
with the Atari, we had a joystick and one button, and
Mhm.
I played
Atari.
arcade cabinets. You wouldn't know,
So-
Banana. You're too young.
Too young.
I had an Atari.
You're like 6 years old. Shut up. Look at the face.
I hate it here.
Yeah. Don't worry. We'll be released soon.
You can see the banana light fading in the background. The
It
analogy
turns out
is
it's not the battery. It's your life force.
yeah. My will to live powers that tiny lamp.
That's not how the Force works, Com. One game that's going to be turning 10, but it looks like a game that would have come out this year. Alien Isolation has an amazing graphical quality to it. Of course, it's first person until you get the cinematics. Cinematics are just amazing. I love Ripley in that one. It's her daughter, of course. And it's just the lighting is so well done. Everything, just the cinematography in it is just superb. It knocks it out the park. The audio stuff is just super. But one thing about that game that always just irks me is there's a lot of things that you do in there that are multiple click to get anything done. So, your headset, you just press one button and it turns on. Okay, great. But if you have to go turn on a generator, for instance, you have to go up to the generator, you have to select the generator, then you have to actually input a wrench, and then you have to press another, left button and right button or whatever it is on mouse and keyboard to turn it to the left. It's just way too many things. And that's a situation where I would prefer you select it, maybe pull out your wrench, and then it becomes a cinematic. I don't need to actively engage to force that issue. I know what to do. Just let me, do the gameplay.
I feel like when to engage like a cutscene or a cinematic is a very tough call in a lot of games, because there are some people who don't want cutscenes in their game at all. They want that harsh dividing line between a movie and a game. To say, if I'm going to play a game, I want to be playing. I don't want to watch the game happen. And for me, that's never been the case. Com and I will probably talk about cutscenes and cinematics in Final Fantasy VII. When I see Diamond Weapon rise out of the ocean, I want to see that and not worry about what I need to do mechanically. I just want to sit in awe of what's going on. And I think cutscenes and little cinematic sequences really give you that opportunity to kind of highlight specific moments in a game. It also does give you the option to just take a breath. and sometimes, especially in a game like Alien Isolation, I feel like that would be really beneficial.
I guess with Alien Isolation, it's very specifically they don't want you to have that feeling.
That's probably what it is.
Yeah, and it's
No
finding
breathing.
what. Yeah, we will not have you breathe. We found it's one of those classic issues that we find in games that we mentioned before about when does gameplay. How do you find the balance between gameplay, the game you're desiring to make, and just the player having a good time. So they might not want you to have that chance to take a breather because Ripley doesn't get a chance to take a breather. On the other hand, you're playing a video game, which means sometimes you just need to stop for a second. You want to put the controller down, you want to take a second break. So they maybe struggle to find that perfect equilibrium between the two situations. The thing I was going to add about cutscenes, particularly, and that diamond weapon cutscene is a wonderful example. So rising up out of the sea, you've got Sister Ray preparing. It's beautifully done. And it avoids, likely due to when it's from, well, actually for a million reasons, but certainly due to when it's from, a pitfall that you can have with cutscenes sometime. And I remember there was a Spider-Man game on, I think it was the Xbox. It wasn't the good Spider-Man game, it was one of the others, where I was watching a cutscene that was about 3 minutes long. And then all of a sudden there was a quick time event mid-cutscene. I mean, my controller was on the side. I probably had like my hand in my trousers, just kind of sitting there zoning out. And then all of a sudden, Peter Parker's dead on the ground because I didn't push triangle quickly enough. The FMVs, the cutscenes, whatever it might be, I really want what Banana said. Take me out of that game entirely. Let me have this movie moment now. 2 minutes, 3 minutes. If it's Metal Gear Solid 4, 4 hours. And let me just live this as it's supposed to be. Don't expect my involvement. I like them clearly defined. I want my game, and then I want my cutscenes nice and separate.
Absolutely. If you're going to do a quick time event, make the introduction of the quick time event quick. That's the quick part. Don't make me wait a day and a half to get to the part where I have to react quickly, because then I don't want to watch the full Lord of the Rings movie and then at the end of it I have to press X to throw the ring into Mount Doom, and if I don't react in time, I have to start the entire movie over again.
Maybe that's where Frodo fucked up.
Yeah,
Didn't push
just
X.
stopped paying attention, just checked out.
Yeah, the Deus Ex Machina of Gollum coming in.
Yeah.
But I think that's actually an interesting thing as well. Is quick time events, I know they get a bad rap, and rightly so, because done badly, they're bad. Yeah, they can be really pulling you out of the game. A well done quick time event, I think, is a really beautiful thing. And oddly enough, Spider-Man, the most recent generation of games, I think have used QuickTime events wonderfully because they use them sparingly and they let you feel those little Spider-Man moments that you probably couldn't do in the game. They need you to be a bit too precise, a bit too finicky. Shooting up the webs off 2 buildings so I can fire my way through this giant concrete tube that's going to get me just up onto the lip of that building that I'm going to run through just in time before the helicopter's blade cuts my head off. It's too awkward in the game. I'm not going to get that cool moment. If this is mid-game, I'm just going to swing around the building and land over there. That's fine. But it's not Spider-Man. So let me have that moment. Brilliant. But it was a problem I had with Final Fantasy 13. And I really enjoyed Final Fantasy 13. But I had this problem where sometimes I thought I could have done with a little quick time event. Because the combat in that game is pretty dull. You spend a lot of time just pushing auto, and not much else. You might occasionally use an item. But your character in that battle will just pick up this sword and go 4 hits, and then you wait for the bar to refill. But in the cutscenes, my goodness, the cool stuff that lightning does. And I had that bizarre moment while playing the game of, why does lightning get to do this cool shit, and I don't get to? I'm playing as lightning. So I would have quite liked to have a little bit of involvement in those quick time events. Let me play along a little bit. And let me show a bit of that character, that mega athletic super swords person. I'd love to do that. I thought it was one of those games where we could have used a few more quick time events.
Honestly, as you were describing the sequence in the Spider-Man game, I was thinking of how cool it is to get to feel like you're the one doing that. So having a quick time event in that moment feels incredible because you get to do something that is, as you said, it doesn't really work in the original engine of the game. So to put an interactive element into this cutscene to say you're still the one who's in control, it's just we didn't have an engine precise enough to make this specific sequence possible. And I think it's very much the character that you control throughout the entire game is doing something awesome. You want to be a part of it. Whereas in the cutscene we were talking about with Final Fantasy VII, as Diamond Weapon is rising out of the ocean and the Sister A is preparing to fire, you are doing the same thing Cloud is. You're staring at it because that's the appropriate reaction in that moment. If Cloud is climbing that monstrosity to strike at its head, I want to be involved in that element of it. But if Cloud is just staring at this thing thinking, shit, I have to fight that? That's what I'm doing as well. So
Yes.
when the character is about to do something awesome, engage the player. When the character is seeing something awesome, let the player watch.
Maybe we can give one that, like Legion, I think probably likes this one. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you probably do. And its quick time event might be an oversell. But there's a renegade moment with Commander Shepard and our dear friend Kai Leng. One of the very last moments they spend
Exactly what
together.
you were talking about.
The satisfaction of pushing that renegade trigger for me was one of my finest moments in that whole game. And they could have played that without me having any involvement. But just the fact that I was the one who got to push that button and make that happen has made that moment stick with me.
That was for Thane, you son of a bitch!
There's very few, and when I say very few, I mean like 2, 3 in my mind that QuickTime events work. I hate QuickTime. I played a lot of Tomb Raider. There's a lot of QuickTime because it came from Sony. They're the ones to blame. But what I hate about QuickTime, especially like in a Mass Effect game, most of the time, is I don't even get to hear the rest of the dialogue. And before you have to make a choice.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I mean, so they're talking and then it pops up, but if I don't do anything, they'll finish the sentence and I didn't get to make a choice. I hate that. So I also hate QuickTime in that it doesn't happen all the time. So even though you, like you said, it's best if you use sparingly, but if it's used sparingly, you don't know when it's going to happen. So you're used to seeing a cinematic that doesn't always have a QuickTime event. And now suddenly I got to be looking for it every single time.
I think this is where we wouldn't be talking on the same lines. I don't want my QuickTime like interspersed at random in long cutscenes once in a while, that kind of thing. For me, your gameplay has to lead directly into the QuickTime event. It can't just be in the middle of a cutscene. By the way, now this is your problem. It's going to have to be mid this sequence. We have a brief signal that I've lost control of the character via the camera being taken away from its usual position, whatever it might be. And within a few moments, I need to know there's going to be a QuickTime event. And the other thing I want, and I think this would alleviate a lot of problems with QuickTime events, because we're back to our usual advice. I'm okay with you do it if you do it well. QuickTime events, don't punish me if I mess it up too much, because they're a bit awkward, a bit finicky. I'm going to need some alternate end to it, maybe. Maybe my Spider-Man doesn't quite make that jump and he's got to go the other way around now and I've got to fix that. Fair enough. But don't have me fail it and Tomb Raider me and have my character end up impaled on spikes.
Right, because Laura dies plenty on her own. She doesn't need an extra reason to just die just because I'm watching a scene, you know? So, and you know, like games like Dragon Age Origins, it doesn't have any QuickTime events in it. And there are moments where, like, especially at the very beginning where you're fighting the ogre and it goes into this slow motion effect that if you're doing melee, that it will actually do this slow motion effect where you're on top of the ogre and you get to stab it and it's this whole like epic little scene. Can you imagine if that was like, oh, you won't get that or whatever if you don't do the quick time for the one time it'll be in the entire game? Just don't do it. Just let me play the game. But on Alien Isolation, I was gonna like refute what you were saying. Like maybe that's not what the game developers wanted me to feel. Well, then how come every time I'm looting a body, I get instant loot? How come I'm not like searching through their body? How come I'm not combing through their pockets to get everything? How come I'm not actually opening a box to get the loot inside the box? My point is that they're selectively choosing the situation. And so because it's an action scene that you actually see movement, Well, then just let it be the movement. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't have to be one or two steps is fine, but there's literally four. It's a 4-step process. There's no reason for that.
I think the obvious answer is just because you subscribe to an idea doesn't mean you have to subscribe to every absurd eventuality of that idea. Essentially, what they've done is they've just decided, in this case, it makes sense because you're looking at a giant console to make you have to tap this in. It doesn't make sense to make you have to root through their pockets and so forth. I'm not defending the execution of it because I think it's an awkward game. It's a tremendous game. And it still looks beautiful, but it is awkward. But I presume that's just where they drew the line in their mind. At some point, we always draw a line somewhere, and that's where they put this. There's also that thing where particularly character models are incredibly awkward to interact with in video games. It's why even to this day, like if we change a character model, for example, there's a moment in Final Fantasy Rebirth, so a very, very modern game with a very high production budget, a very high quality team. The team who worked on Rebirth all worked on Remake within reason, so they know what they're doing, they're focused, etc. There's a scene where a character, it's nothing big banana, a character takes a piece of jewelry essentially they have in their hair and hands that to you. They are never going to show you the character take that jewelry out because now they've got to model the hair moving differently. Now they've got to model the ribbon being untied. Now they've got to do this. So the character lifts their hands up as though they're going to do it. We cut away. And when we cut back, we've got the other character model now and the hair's down and yada, yada, yada. So it's just that, the idea of interacting with these individual character models is so awkward that something like rifling through pockets would be so much harder to do than this box that you have to than this computer you have to interact with, etc.
Sure, but you could imagine a scene where they're animating you with your hands on like the lab coat or just something to show that it took time in a horror game that's forcing you to be silent and make your way. And so if they're going to say, hey, look, you're going to have to do this in order to open the next section, it's click, 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 click. Why is it, only on that one? I know you're not defending it. I'm just saying, as far as character models and things like that,
the hell,
I think
Tom?
it could have.
Stop defending.
Yeah. I know.
I worked on that game.
I know you're not defending it, Com. So just.
The more you say I know you're not defending it, the more I get the urge to defend it.
Yeah. I honestly think it's sounding more and more like a command. You're not defending it.
These aren't droids you're looking for.
The consistency of it. So if you want me to be immersed and feel like I have to have this certain, regardless of the game or whatever we're talking about, then just be consistent with that type of immersion. So don't just throw these extras. Cyberpunk 2077 got a lot of rap from me too. Why is it in first person? Constantly in first person. And I actually read the reason why, and it made a lot of sense to me. And having played the game all the way through, I'm glad it's first person only. There's a certain...
You can ask someone who hated the decision.
Yeah.
Please tell me.
Yeah. So the philosophy is that you are inside your head and you cannot get out. That is the situation. And so the moments where you have Johnny who's outside of you is kind of like your relief, because although that is inside of you and it's progressively becoming more and more part of you, there's a certain interaction there that is dynamic, and it couldn't happen in any other situation, right? You wouldn't just have a conversation with your friend because he's a separate agency. He's a separate agent and an entity, but you are within yourself, and there's nowhere else to go. And so you're kind of fighting this battle where you're you against you, really. So there's that. And if you play the game all the way through, if you choose certain resolutions, you do get a different camera angle. And it is a world of difference. You feel it because you've been playing the game 99% of the time one way, and now you see it differently because you've met that end, Now you can see the world differently. And it really sinks in. It's almost like a cutscene that you never know you wanted until you got it. So
can't say I know how it was supposed to be, but somehow I feel
What?
like I just stepped out of a room I'd been locked inside of. Don't know what that feeling is. Hope? Fulfillment?
Don't try to name it. Just enjoy it. I feel the same way. Besides, you'll come to understand it once we're on the other side. You'll see. You ready?
Been ready always.
Then hit it! Home stretch! Full speed ahead!
They've launched the drones.
Carol! Cassidy! Get moving!
I'm heading west and activating the jammers.
They've marked me. I'm turning east to get them off your tail. Good luck, kids. See you on the other side.
The nitro is ready. Say goodbye to Night City. It's your last chance.
Got nothing left to say. Start her up. The wheel is yours.
Let's ride! Exactly what you wanted. A new beginning.
Don't slow down, Pan Am. Not yet.
Well?
It's perfect. All great, Pan Am. We're going home.
This kind of goes back a little bit, but when you guys were speaking about Alien Isolation, I think you kind of highlighted on what might be the next quantum leap for gaming. And I think it's those elements of gameplay that can't be rendered in engine. So you'll have a cutscene that is completely different and kind of harshly cuts away from your normal experience. because rendering it in engine, rendering the fine precision that you're trying to get out of this experience isn't really something that they wanted to spend 14 months doing for an 8-second cutscene. And that might be the next huge leap we see, is where an engine becomes so advanced that you can render whatever precise thing you want to in engine. Uh, and I think looking back, you'll see like the very, very harsh separation between in-game engine and those FMVs, say Final Fantasy VII, where the characters in those cutscenes don't even look like the same characters, because they were able to do a lot more detail in those cutscenes. And maybe we'll see games eventually where everything is in engine and it still looks incredible, and you still have that kind of a limitless possibility of what a character can do. I would really look forward to that, but I can't imagine how much work it's going to take to get there.
I'd imagine at that point you'll probably see the increase in minor usage of AI within game studios, for example, to help out that process. You might find that if we're creating a scene where, for example, the one I mentioned earlier of a character removing a hair tie from their hair, so you're now going to have all the hair floating around and so forth, as opposed to being that static model it was when you had it in the hair tie. You'll probably have animators keyframe it, where they just do one in every 10 frames or one in every 30 or whatever, and then they'll fill the gaps with the AI to hopefully help them along. And that might be one of the ways you could actually see artificial intelligence used in that positive sense within video gaming, where it isn't having a direct impact upon the creative process, which I don't think is where we really want to see it. And also at the same time isn't affecting the employment and livelihoods of the people doing the work. But I'd imagine that's probably a topic for another time.
Yeah, there's certain games like Hellblade that took a camera and mapped the scenes along with the acting. So they're transposing the data into an engine that recreated the scene, rocks, the surf, whatever. It was all recorded originally and basically digitally reprocessed into that scene. So there is that. The problem is that the storytelling from 1 to 2 wasn't as good. So I enjoyed the game. I'm not going to say anything bad about the game. I think they did a really good job, but where its criticism, where its criticism came was that it was more of a movie than it was a game, and people wanted to play a game. They didn't want to watch a movie. So even though we're talking about, will there be a time where those graphics we're there already, but you have to have the game meet the expectations of the player, and if that doesn't happen, they're going to look at alternative means. They're going to say, look, that didn't work. Well, they're not going to blame it on the other aspects, perhaps. They're going to say, look, we did all this stuff for the graphical immersion, but it didn't work. But one game that might be coming out, we don't know when, but I think is incorporating some of those techniques, is Elder Scrolls 6. And from what I've understood, everything I've heard, they're taking some of that technology and trying to recreate a world where it's hyper realistic. So you can imagine Skyrim, but in Skyrim, and the reason why Bethesda takes so long to make their games, and we've talked about this before, is that they could take the Unreal Engine. They could do whatever they want and put out a game.
I wish they would.
Yeah. But they use their specific engines so that way they can allow modders to have free access or easier access into the game code. And so by creating a modding environment, they're able to kind of make the game last longer and make it more relevant, because people just, once they get into modding Skyrim and stuff, there's no end to that. they just love adding to it. And how realistic can we make it? And so it becomes a game within a game. But yeah, no, they won't use Unreal. They won't go that direction because they want to use a code specific to them. So that way they can have a creator's creation kit available to its players.
I really thought you were going to say the reason it takes Bethesda so long is because they have to pack so many bugs into their game.
Yeah, that is a studio, I'm afraid, that despite my very heartfelt affection for some of their products, they lost that sort of free pass that they get from me sometimes. Hideo Kojima gets a free pass from me. I will trust what he's putting out next because he's earned enough credit. Square, same thing. Bethesda, I think the elegant way of phrasing it is to say they pissed away a lot of goodwill over the years.
And it's understandable. I'm just saying that's the reason why they do what they do. So if you're going to have it's not like they can get with the Unreal development group, the program specialist, and say, hey, look, this game is not doing this, like these other game developers have the ability to do. They don't have that. It's within their own engine. They have to fix it.
Again, I wish they would. I really wish they would.
Well, that's what actually is causing. That's why I'm a little excited about where BioWare is going, because apparently that's what they were creating. They were EA was saying you got to use this engine, you got to use that engine, and they were putting a
Frostbite. They were using
Frostbite for the
Are you
Mass Effect
suggesting
4.
that EA making bad decisions?
Yeah. Because the engine itself was good, it's just not good for RPGs. I mean, they had to basically do Dragon Age Inquisition from the ground up and make it work to meet the engine's what it did. And so now they've abandoned that. I'm very hopeful that the next projects that they have, Mass Effect 4, will have a tighter schedule now.
Let's hope so. Just going to say, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Unreal Engine. You can do a lot with that. It's nice to see it being used in that way for it. I'm not a huge fan of the in-house engine thing, with some exceptions. There are some outstanding ones. Sometimes I'm not as big of a fan of that. But I think really, honestly, what we haven't mentioned actually is just really the role of cutscenes. And particularly like their evolution over the history of video gaming, how that changed. If you think back to Final Fantasy VII, because it's always the one that was used as this first big example of a game feeling like a movie, this cinematic experience that you have on your video game console. It was advertised with the FMV count, I think, published on the back of the box as a point of pride. However many minutes it was, let's say an hour, I guess. I presume not much more, just based purely on disc size. But this was a badge of honor. We're going to have this many FMVs in our video game. And I feel now we almost would look down on a game. If you say, not FMVs, but if you say that we have X amount of cutscenes in our game and hold that up as one of your big seals of approval, we'd almost have changed over the years to being a bit more, salty is the wrong word, but a bit more negative about that whole idea of the why are you putting all this time into cutscenes when you could be putting more time into gameplay. And I think it's just an interesting psychological difference that we've seen over not a long time. I mean, 30 years is not a long time.
I think the the element of the technology behind those
That's good.
different pieces kind of plays into our appreciation for how much cutscenes make an appearance in a game. So in Final Fantasy VII, in games around that era, the cutscenes were much more detailed, much more impressive visually than the graphics in engine. I mean, we both love those painted backdrops, but everything else superimposed on those backdrops, it felt clunky. It didn't look as polished. But in those FMV sequences, you're looking at these and thinking, well, this is very cool. This is interesting. They're able to show me a lot more detail in these, and we appreciated that. And because they used them for specific moments of high importance, or specific moments that just showcased something really cool, something that visually we wanted to see. And I feel like now, because that technology has advanced to the point where there's not quite as harsh a disconnect between a cutscene or an FMV and the in-engine graphics, we appreciate it substantially less because we bought it for the gameplay. We bought it to play a game. And if you can show me something that cool in engine, I don't need a cutscene. The cutscene takes me out of it a little bit. So I would appreciate it if you can deliver that detail, that quality in engine. If you can't, that FMV better be amazing.
I love the self censorship. So it may be that simple. It may be as simple as the advancements of technology and the way that where we set our expectations now between cutscenes and gameplay. Which, like you say, we couldn't have done that a long time ago. There are, well, let's think of just that one that we mentioned now 3 or 4 times. That diamond weapon
Mhm.
cutscene in Final Fantasy VII. You could not have done that in the engine.
Mhm.
There was simply no way of doing it. But I think there was also something else as well. Maybe Legion have something to say on this too. Is I think a lot of those cutscenes in those older games didn't outstay their welcome. They were typically a minute long, 90 seconds, 2 minutes. And sometimes they were also a showcase for maybe a new song that you hadn't heard yet as well. And I thought they really used them in an efficient way. And possibly that lack of graphical fidelity they were working with meant that, honestly, drawing them out didn't really serve that much purpose. They were in there to get in your face quickly, show you the big event, and then move on. We don't overstay our welcome. Back to the game.
Yeah, the games like Dark Pictures and The Quarry. I know Banana loves those games, but I mean they're just highly they're highly cinematic. To me, I actually really like them. I'm not as big fan of the Dark Pictures because I just don't like the stories for them. But overall, I mean, I don't think they really kind of, at least they're consistent with their immersions. Yeah.
Are the game.
Yeah.
That's the focus. That's the whole point. If you don't like the stories, you don't like the game.
It's going to be okay, Banana.
It's not okay.
Dark Pictures is not in the room with you. It's okay.
Dark Pictures can't hurt you.
You can't
say that.
Yeah, the evidence is piling up. That's not correct. Dark Pictures, is that the same company who made, oh goodness gracious, the game with Hayden Panettiere? Until Dawn.
I was after I said hope, I was like, no. The word you were thinking of was dawn, but it's too embarrassing to acknowledge that you thought those two were the same.
Well, that I think is a very, very interesting game. It's one of those games where it's barely a video game at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
It really is the interactive movie, which I also feel is something that you see less and less.
I feel like if it had been advertised as an interactive movie, I would be less frustrated with it. But the idea that it's advertised as a game and it's very much, let's take these people who are actors, let's make 3D models of them, and then present you with an interactive movie. Just let me watch a movie.
That isn't 14 hours long.
Yeah. Just let me watch a movie where I can't get the movie wrong. Like,
how do you feel about an interactive cartoon?
I feel better about that.
Because you've done it. The Dragon's Lair.
That's absolutely true.
Banana's one of the few people I know that sat there and finished Dragon's Lair.
Hold on, why don't I know what Dragon's Lair is? I should know this, right?
Dragon's Lair is,
oh my goodness, that game.
It's an arcade game that was
I know it.
made available on console. I believe it's Don Bluth Animations. Don Bluth being like the major competitor for Disney for a long period of time. Hand-drawn cells of everything integrated into a video game that is interactive in your decisions navigating from scene to scene. And it is incredibly difficult because the timing is very narrow and there's not really an indication of what you need to do beyond it has to be one of 5 things. You could go up, down, left, right, or use your sword. And that's pretty much the only options. And you have to process the scene very quickly, determine which thing is going to help you in this situation, and make that decision rapidly.
We had Definitely gonna need this on screen.
Oh, I'm sure there's plenty of footage. If not, check one of my VODs. I played it on Twitch.
Yeah, I can record some, but I'm not going to do it like an in-game playthrough. That's Banana's thing.
Oh, no. Rightly so.
It's and I think that one may get a pass from me because of the era in which it was released. But also
19
because it doesn't use 3D models of real people, which is something I find very stupid for an interactive movie.
Well, back then, actually, a lot of the cartoons, if you remember the Lord of the Rings cartoon, which is really just human, and they did I forgot what it's called, but they basically had live action, and they just drew the cells with the action, not obviously, not in real time.
Right.
Stay still. Is this the ninth?
It's hand-drawn stop motion.
Is this the ninth? Sorry, that's an amazing idea. Is that?
Mhm.
It's the 1978 Ralph Bakshi one, right? Ralph Bakshi.
Yeah, there's actually a scene where like Aragorn, he trips on his sword, and they left it in. They drew it like that. He tripped on his sword. It was like a total accident.
I was looking for a joke about how when people watch that, it's like when Aragorn breaks his toe kicking the Uruk-hai helmet.
Yeah.
Everyone has to point it out.
Yeah. Did you know? Everyone knows.
He did what?
It's over. Podcast's over.
Well, so is
this just turns into that joke in every episode from now on.
That's our new thing. It's our new thing. Every podcast, you need your USP. That's ours.
or Com just comes in with the random Lord of the Rings trivia at the end. Did you?
But it's
know?
always that.
Yeah.
It's either that
always
or fake.
that.
So is there, I mean, obviously the type of game is going to, sway the opinion on that, but is there a specific type of field of view or camera style that you guys would prefer if you knew a game was going to be coming out tomorrow? Like, what would you prefer?
So the genre of game matters. I will say, I think one of the games that I have played that did all of this excellently is God of War. Specifically, I remember God of War 2 very clearly. There are the traditional gameplay elements where I believe you can control the camera yourself and you kind of navigate through combat in that way. And typically you'll reach a point where an enemy is extremely low on health, or maybe it's a boss fight and you're presented with the opportunity to enter a quick time event. And then you proceed through the quick time event. You typically get rewarded with a particularly gruesome death for that enemy. And then you proceed back to the traditional camera angle. And the regular gameplay, the quick time events, and cutscenes are all very immediately recognizable. You're never going to get confused about which one of those you're in. And I think that shows that they did it right. Because if you're watching a cutscene and suddenly it's a quick time event, you're going to be frustrated.
Yeah.
If you're in the middle of a quick time event and then suddenly you're not playing the game anymore and you're just watching, you're going to be disappointed. And if you can't tell when you're playing the game normally, that's just terrible. That's a far cry from what we're looking for.
Oddly enough, one of the greatest little tidbits I think you could ever give as advice for someone working in game design is don't frustrate your player. Because there's nothing worse than just frustration with something. You can be angry at something, you can be annoyed at something, you can be sad about something. But that feeling of frustration, that the pained why is the worst thing you're going to have.
Why?
So yeah. Why? as Lara is impaled for the 14th time on those tubes. I think for myself, the camera angle, that I'm going to be most interested in, that I'd like to see the most, I'm going to go a bit higher brow and channel Winston Churchill's quote for a second about democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. I think the third-person camera, left stick controlling the character, right stick controlling the camera, is the worst kind of camera angle, except for all the others. I want that one.
I was about to say Mass Effect.
Elden Ring. I genuinely think that has an amazing camera, except when it goes wrong.
Mhm.
It feels beautiful in the open world, you know that. It's just the right distance away from your character, just the right sensitivity, just the right default position. Its problem comes like when Legion mentioned towards the start, just sometimes when you're up against a cliff or something like that, it gets a bit awkward. But as a general principle, I think that's about as good a camera as we've ever come up with.
Yeah. For me, it seems to be like the games that I've been playing, especially lately, over the shoulder. You know, Mass Effect, Ghost of Tsushima, God of War. I mean, they're all over the shoulder. Witcher 3, Witcher 2. The next one behind that would be like Orbital. So if I have a game where like it's not really, it's based on what I'm clicking, not so much the first person combat. So not like things like Elden Ring or Dark Souls, obviously, but
Something like
MMOs do that a lot. Yeah, WoW does that. But that's my second favorite, I guess. If it's not a first person.
I feel like we accidentally twisted your question into what games did camera angles really well.
Elden Ring. And just that one thing that I'm sure we'll have a sort of global agreement on is the Baldur's Gate, XCOM, that what's the word? Isometric?
Isometric.
Yeah, that camera angle is a classic. It may have had its heyday. You may well only see it now in throwback games or in specific individual games. But there's a lot to be said for that.
Mm. I am curious though. Do you think there is any 2D game that screwed up cameras?
I mean, there were a lot of Atari games back in the
day. But is that screwing up the point of view, or is that just an Atari game?
You got to remember, so I remember like playing Crawl. Remember the movie Crawl? That was you only had like everything was flat, but you know, you had you would throw the glaive and it would go up and down, up and down. That was easy to understand, but it would also, in some scenes, you know, because not everything was always the same thing. It would be like a more lateral screen. You just couldn't really tell what really to do in that game sometimes. But that's going way back. So
you just reminded me of Zelda's Adventure, which is top-down digitized graphics. And that game is horrific. It is irredeemably bad. And I may or may not have paid money to elevate that above Skyward Sword in a ranking of best Zelda games. But holy hell, that game was awful.
I can offer you a very strange thing. When you said you reminded me of a game, my one is much more shameful. It's sadly not a game I've ever played, although I'd love to. I don't know how you would play it nowadays. It's got to be somewhere. But it was on the idea that a 2D camera game is hard to mess up. There's a
good catch.
Help. Nailed it. There is a 2D game. It's from the 1980s, and this is back when you had that British boom of homemade games. So there's normally one-person teams, two-person teams, and there's this huge world of video games in the 80s, particularly out of the UK. And you've just reminded me of this. It's a game called Beat 'em and Eat 'em. And
you have my attention.
So you have at the very top of the screen a man aiming downwards, and he's firing projectiles down. And at the very bottom of the screen, there are two ladies walking back and forth, and you have to catch the projectiles. And that piece of trash has a perfectly good camera. Just because it was so damn simple that there really wasn't something to get wrong. Elden Ring doesn't have a perfect camera because of how good its camera design is, because of how interesting it is, because of that freedom and liberty it gives you. This terrible game has a perfectly good camera because it didn't try and do anything interesting. There's a lesson to be taken from this, and I think it's not a good one, and people shouldn't listen to it.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say, is it's hard to mess up 2D. It's been done. You can mess it up, but you really got to put your back into it if you're going to mess up 2D.
Well, I mean, I guess we've covered it quite a bit. I'm pretty sure we'll circle back to a lot of these subjects and themes as we tend to do. But appreciate everybody being here. And of course, if everybody that's listening on an audio podcast, we do have a YouTube channel. If you want to see us there, you can. And of course, comments are always appreciated. Like, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Helps us really grow the platform to others who may be interested in this type of stuff. So again, we'll see you guys later. And if there's anything you want to see, make sure you tell us. But y'all take care for now. Bye-bye.